So good morning, gentlemen. Anyone listening, whether it's morning or not?
Morning.
Anthony, James, Arliss, Mark, and I are together. I believe MK is going to join us. He's on the road somewhere, but he's responded yesterday and said he was going to come in, so we may see him in a minute. So good morning, Anthony, you were saying?
Yeah, I like your outline. We've been talking about it for a few weeks, but you finally put it into writing, which was good. It was right on time. It wasn't confusing. It was pretty straightforward.
What did you read?
The email that you sent?
No, I mean, what did you get out of it? What was up?
Yeah, what we've been talking about, let me just think for a second, is about I'd like to look at it one more time, but it's the thoughts, it's everything that we've been talking about. I just got to look at it one more time to refresh my memory, but it's about what makes us who we are and memories. I think we talked about memories.
You want to pull it up and read it?
Yeah, I'll do that right now. Hold on one second.
Mark, now I know exactly where you're sitting. I just had lunch with Mark the other day and got a tour of his palace.
Okay, so
You there?
I think you sent like some links to some other stuff, including like the Viktor Frankl stuff.
All right, I should be back. I think I was gone for a second. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
I listened to the Viktor Frankl Bill W podcast that you linked, or part of it, on logotherapy.
What'd you hear?
It was good. It was just I mean, I like the piece that was talking about having controlling, having an attitude, your attitude towards suffering. I mean, they were trying to it seems like he was linking some of the 12-step stuff to what Viktor Frankl was suggesting. And I don't know, I just kind of got into like the first 10 minutes of it, but but it seems like for me, like in just dealing with life, it's always my attitude that can be affecting how I experience things, good and bad, and always something I'd like to keep positive, because alternately it tends to be I tend to not be very functional when I have a negative attitude towards things.
You know, at the tail end of the 12-step in the 12 and 12 that I've been listening, I got it on audio, and so I'm rather than reading it and having my brain sort of flow off in these different directions, I've been listening to it. It kind of took on a whole new dimension. But it's probably the most concise, comprehensive writing about the entire program, including beyond the steps itself, like I mentioned to you, I think, James, romance, finance, demands, overdependence, failure, fitting in, belonging, finding your place, financial security, and then the insecurity of actually having money and coming to terms with the fact that we can become as pitiful about that as we were when we didn't have it. But in the tail end of it, just before it ends, he says, understanding is the key to right principles and attitudes, and right, what was the next? And right action is all about good living, is the point of good living, which is the essence of the 12th step. It's actually taking everything and putting it into the one step as a culmination of everything we've learned, and taking our hands off of the lies in each one of the steps and starting to be introduced to the fact that life is principled by nature, not something we make up, not something we have to think of, but certainly when we begin thinking of principles, and he's speaking about spiritual principles, which are, he called affirmative action. And that's often missed in a lot of what I hear people talk about. They say action is the key. Well, if it's wrong action and I'm taking it, I'm going to have a bad attitude. I'm not going to be thinking in terms that are healthy because the consequences I'm going to be facing are things I'm going to think I shouldn't be getting because I'm not thinking I'm doing the thing to cause them. So, and attitudes are interesting because one of the elements of a plane flying is its attitude. The attitude is wrong, it's not going to fly very well. Not going to perform very well in the aerodynamics it's designed to function with. And it's no different in our experience. So I'm not sure I heard exactly what you listened to, James, but I understand certainly the principles are the key issue of the 12 steps, allowing the concept that there is an absolute state of being that is present regardless of whether we think it is or not. And if we're thinking we're disconnected, there's a good chance we're thinking about thinking as being that absolute source rather than thinking of that absolute source as being absolute, regardless of what I think.
Yeah, I realized I went through the rabbit hole. I ended up in a Wikipedia on Viktor Frankl where he was explaining that we're all searching for meaning in life, and that's really the goal. And we can do that by doing some sort of action, creating a good work or doing a good deed. Secondly, by experiencing something or encountering someone, which may be through meetings or fellowship. And then third, by the attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering. The only thing I struggle with a little bit is there's a piece of it where he was explaining that something where it has to, the barriers to humanity's quest for meaning is warning against affluence, hedonism, and materialism. I get the hedonism bit, but I certainly have material goals and don't like to think that gets in the way of my quest for meaning or happiness, I guess.
I think he's referring, subtle leap, but I think he's referring to the addiction to thinking more will be enough when the thinking you're doing has no basis, and more can never be enough to turn that thinking into reality. And that's basically the addiction to any addiction is always about more. And when more is never enough, any sense would suggest that something's wrong in the equation. And yet with addiction, we think I have nothing to do with it. It's happening to me rather than being caused by me. And mental addiction is a little tricky because we don't actually see the thing. We're not picking up a drink. We're not smoking a joint. We're not injecting heroin. We're not doing those things that would give us the opinion it's an outside substance that we're struggling with, rather than realize that the lack of substance in our thinking is the ultimate core of the mental disease of addiction. And I think it's easy to see in the world that we seem to be wanting more and more and more and more, and yet more doesn't seem to be enough. So people are consistently sort of preoccupied with the idea that more can be enough, when in fact the substance of their thinking, if it's substanceless, can never be more, because it's like a fraction with a zero as a denominator. It's never going to add up to anything. There's nothing you can add the biggest number and you can put infinity in the numerator, but you're still going to end up with zero. That's really what we're talking about here in terms of the mental obsession. You can't be obsessed enough with a thought to turn it into reality. And the only reason we're obsessed with thinking is because they're not real and we think they should be. That idea that our life is thinking and our reality is thinking has us make believe that more and more thinking confirms who we are and what we are, while feeling displaced, disconnected, and lonely. So the contrary effect is obviously telling us that what we're doing has no basis. Like Bill says, whenever we are disturbed, something is wrong with us. What's wrong is the thinking we're doing. Doesn't mean we can't do it. It means that when we're doing it, we think it's right. We've now taken something that we have the right to think, but the right to think doesn't mean what we think is right and how we think is right. And it's really how and what we're thinking that we struggle with, not thinking. Thinking is always working and functioning on the basis that it's designed to, without our choices and conclusions and decisions. My sense also, when you're talking about negativity, is that negative and positive are part of the same thing. Everything in the universe functions on a basis of negativity and positivity. Electrons, neurons, protons, atoms, molecules, all the basic substructure, the subatomic structure. And magnets are a very good example of that. You may remember that I had this a long time ago when we started, this pair of magnets. They're easier to see here. If you put them positive to positive, they repel. If you put them negative to negative, they repel. But when you put them in proper order, they naturally attract. So now the positive and the negative are the sum total of the pieces that just seem to be separate. So it's the same way with our ideas about thinking something is wrong and what we need to do is the opposite, when the thing that's wrong is thinking the opposite isn't connected to what we're doing. When I make a choice, I'm taking a position amongst all positions that can be taken. Doesn't make that position right, it makes it a choice. And if I think as a result that that's the only position I can take, now I'm addicted to the position, which means I'm fighting the fact that all the other positions even exist. So choice now feels condemned. And choice can't be condemned if it has always allowed the choice not to be chosen. So that struggle is a thought struggle. It isn't in reality, because reality knows exactly how magnetic forces work, and they are all working right now sufficiently to allow the universe to continue for us to even have this conversation.
So maybe my negative thinking is not the enemy, it's just I'm not attracting the right magnet.
Well, think about it being, you're trying to negate. Negativity is trying to negate. It's a minus in the plus column. If positive and negative are balanced, they're neutral, right? So neutrality is a place we're taken to, apparently, by this source that's actual rather than imagined, this pure source of being, the nature of nature. And the book says we're taken to a place of neutrality. It seems to have happened for us rather than be done by us. Says it just happens, right? Because it's always happening. It's always here. It's always now. It's always what we're experiencing. And yet what we think is a bodily function. And so what we feel is the body's perspective on how we're thinking. It's telling us, giving us perspective on how we're thinking. If we feel disturbed, what I say to myself is I'm thinking something that's disturbing, and I stop there. I don't try to figure out what it is. I just say I'm thinking something that's disturbing. And the reason I don't try to figure out what it is because most of what I'm thinking that disturbs me, I don't even think I'm thinking. Because I've been addicted to it for so long, I think that it's the nature of my nature. I think it's just who I am. And really, it's just something I'm doing. And to think of it in terms of figuring it out rather than simply conceding what I can know now continues to create a relationship with it that suggests I can't solve it because it seems to be somewhere else doing something else that seems to be a mystery, when in fact the obvious nature of the disturbance is present and obvious. And if I just allow that to be sufficient, I'm actually addressing what's happening in the present rather than thinking of it as something that isn't present somewhere else, someplace else, someplace I have to get to. And it begins to bring, it immediately brings peace to the relationship because there is no conflict in having what I'm having while I'm having what I'm having in terms of the effect. Same goes for bad and wrong and all those other feelings that seem to be distinct, but they're all just sort of fractured versions of the same thing. So if there's any morality that comes out of the principles because they're spiritual, it would be to be honest about the experience. Wouldn't be moral to think that what's happening shouldn't be happening while it's happening. That would just be causing the thing that I'm now thinking I shouldn't be doing simultaneously. So I become the master of the cause and the victim and slave to the effect, which is sort of what you're describing, James. Seems to be impossible to escape. And since all things are always possible, and one of those possibilities is to think that all things are impossible, it again comes down to thinking that is the cause of that opinion, not reality, not truth, not an absolute loving nature of generosity and support and forgivingness. It's the forgetfulness of me thinking about my thinking as being all I am, and now I need to get and get and get and get and get more and more and more to try to make up for the hole I've created in reality, which is impossible to do. Morning, Jackie. So if I'm choosing impossibility, my experience was I used to think life is impossible. So rather than concede on choosing it and I'm the responsible party for it, I immediately go telescopic and take what I'm doing and turn it into what is happening for everyone everywhere. Life becomes impossible. Life becomes hard. Life becomes complicated. Life is a mystery. The mystery is, why do I keep doing the same thing and think I have nothing to do with it? And the answer is, it's an induced state of insanity giving me an impression that's absolutely not true because I'm seeing and hearing things that don't even exist as my seemingly chosen reality. The beautiful thing about reality and truth and the absolute nature of nature is we don't have to choose it at all. It's the nature of our even potential to even question it. It's already who and what we are made of, not something we have to come to terms with. And yet coming to terms with it on a human level allows us to begin to function on life's terms and allow the law and order of those terms to become the source of our principled thinking rather than the thinking we're doing about our thinking that is not moral, to make believe it is reality and truth and wonder why all those complications keep seeming to pop up and all those byproducts of compulsions and trying to get more and wanting more and always finding that I can't seem to get enough. If I'm thinking in scarce thoughts, so scarce as to not even exist in reality at all, just simply something happening in my head, my thoughts, why wouldn't I create scarcity as a consequence? Certainly, I'm not expressing the abundance of my nature. I'm expressing the scarcity of a thought that has no basis. And then wondering why my actions lead to scarcity and a lack and a constant pining for more, better. Even when I get it, it's not enough. It becomes the new threshold of the bottom rather than something that is worth saying, thanks. Wow, nice. Appreciate that. talking about this, thinking about this alone, first of all, we're never alone. So to think we can think about it alone is an idea that isn't true, because whatever we're thinking, wherever we are actually in this web of energy, whatever it is we share, and we're affecting it. It's like economies. Every dollar that's spent affects it. Every dollar that is not spent affects the economy. Every single one of them may not be as noticeable as $1 billion, but the effect is actually still an effect. We have an impact. And to sit alone and think about these things and not talk about them openly, which I found I hadn't done in my experience. I'd kept a lot of this to myself because I sounded like crazy to talk about it, and still do for many. Because it sounds absurd that something could possibly be so simple as to have caused as much dysfunctional, contaminated, corrupt behavior amongst a whole species of people. And I would suggest this has been going on as long as self-indignation has been used to suppress and oppress and kill people for the sake of what they thought. We always talk about it as being different people, different colors, different shapes, different sizes, but it really is never any of those things. It's what people think that we fight over. Why would I need to fight over my thinking if it was absolutely natural, I would have nothing but confidence in it. I wouldn't be defensive, I wouldn't be reactive. I would simply express it.
I had a good experience with earlier this year with I wanted to go see a therapist because I had a rough year, and she says she's this Eastern European lady, and she does like the Jungian stuff, and she says, "Why are you coming to see me?" And I said, "Well, my buddy killed himself. Both my parents died. I just got over a relapse, and I'm kind of in a bad shape." And I was expecting a certain response, and her response was wonderful, and that it shook me because I was like, what is, I don't know if she heard what I heard, but she said it was funny because it helped me like I mean she's been tremendous, and it just helped me like not look at it with such a darkness.
Why did she say it was wonderful?
Well, I think she's happy that I'm coming to see her. She's happy that I think
Okay.
I was ready to talk about it, that I was ready to like deal with it, or I don't know that I was ready to deal with it. I was kind of at wit's end and just doing what I thought was going to give me support. But no, she's and throughout, like I was seeing her twice a week for a while. Now it's once a week, but every time I come to her with a negative thing, she responds with like a positive observation of it. And it always like just like stops me in my shoes with like what I think I'm going to continue talking about, or what I'm going to continue to deal with, whether it's the fear, resentment, grief, or whatever. And so yeah, it's been a really good experience to have that, to have her, have someone kind of challenge me, and maybe I give her more deference because she's a therapist or something, where if a normal person in the street would have said that, I would have probably clocked him or something. Who knows?
That's the spirit.
Yeah.
So the word ready, I think, is an interesting word in that. And I suspect, James, that what's wonderful for her is when somebody's actually ready to come there and deal with what's happening. Like they've had enough. Think about this. Enough is never enough. But when we've had enough, we are actually at a bottom. And the bottom is actually the top, because it's the beginning of walking out of the hole we dug. It's literally the beginning. And that, to me, is that moment of clarity, that thing we talk about, where you just come to terms with the fact that you look at things honestly for the first time and say, you know what, my suspicion is, and I think socially we're seeing this today, is that all of those perilous things we seem to be facing are all cries for help that we don't know how to put words to and say, I need help. And it isn't until we develop the problem large enough, and humanity has been very good at this. We tend to think that if we can postpone the problem for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. Nuclear waste is a great example. Stuff's going to last millions of years, and we've got 30-year solutions that aren't working. But it seems as though we need enough wrong before we actually begin to look at it accurately, because we've been denying so long as a source of reality that the idea of being proactive immediately makes no sense. We've become desensitized and numb to the activities we're doing in the present, which is where everything always happens, and keep wondering why things seem to keep getting worse in other respects. But I think
Surrender to
wins. Well, and that readiness is a word that's used in the book, even in the 12th step. In it, he says that we have this wonderful experience, and while it may be a higher power, there were some things we did to prepare us for it, to be ready for it. There was some part we played. And I think my experience, that's incredibly important to recognize that we are each of us has the right to think whatever we want. So whatever we think we want, whatever we're thinking we want, and to not want what comes as a consequence is a good indication that we're trying to disavow our right to that thinking. We're trying to pretend it's not us doing the thinking to cause a problem, when in fact, the thinking might have been half-baked. And so the consequence naturally created was actually accurate to the thinking. We just thought fantastically and wishful thinkingly that what we were going to get was what we fantasized we'd get by acting on that thought, which is childish and immature, which is a hallmark in that same step. Study was done, and it said that many of the alcoholics that they interviewed were emotionally immature and grandiose. Why would we need to be grandiose if we weren't trying to cover something up that was inferior and vulnerable and weak? Anthony, did you find that thing? You want to read it?
Yeah, I have it right here.
You want to read it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see.
Sets them down gently.
1 sec.
There's a TV again.
Yeah, let me try to mute it. Sorry. It's that How It Works, How It's Made show. They showed how they made the space buggy, the moon buggy. It says, our discussion's focus and purpose is to openly discuss the core mental addiction to obsessive thinking that precedes reactive, impulsive, compulsive. What's the difference between impulsive and compulsive?
Impulses isn't acted on. Compulsions are the acting out of the impulse.
Really? Impulsive.
And the impulse is a reaction.
Okay. That reflects thoughts that we can think we don't have, thus think we aren't doing, thus think there is nothing that can be done about them. So continuing to repeat them seems to make perfect sense. Inner conflict, emotional turmoil, and mental anguish are the body's language speaking to the disturbing and disruptive effects of the distraction and disorder this mental disease causes. While the disturbing effects we witness can have different faces, places, and times, the underlying mechanism triggered is the same, so inducing fear. Anxiety and stress are natural consequences of obsessive thoughts. Human beings come and go, but principles go on and on. Jackson, Michigan, People and Principles, 1971.
That was actually the grapevine reading for the day that I thought was worth mentioning. The last sentence, humans come and go. It's like thoughts come and go, principles remain. We're dealing with an absolute state of being. If that absolute state of being is absolute, we didn't choose it. And to think we can choose it is to think that we're more powerful than it, meaning it goes away when we think it isn't there. And that's, I would say, the critical fulcrum, the center point, the centerpiece of the thinking that is corrupt and corrupted by the thinking about the thinking. Like you said, James, you were almost committed going in there to talking about the negative thoughts you were having, the sort of demoralized thoughts you were having, and she burst the bubble. She's taken a pin and popping the bubble when in fact the bat you've been using for years to try to pop it hasn't worked. The heavy-handedness, the overexertion, the demands, the abuse, the self-abuse, the abusing of your own experience in the name of thinking someday you're going to beat yourself into a better way of doing things. Never works. What it does is give us the impression it's the only thing we can do, because we become so consumed with that experience that it seems like the only thing that's happening, and that all of a sudden life becomes that. So the definition for impulse, Anthony, sudden involuntary inclination, meaning a triggered thought, prompting to action. And most action is considered outward. I would suggest thinking is in fact an action, because it's something we choose and it's something we do and it's something that occurs. And that pretty much defines an action. So if we're missing the fact that the thinking precedes every voluntary outer action, if we miss that thinking is a choice and that we're free to make those choices, we're missing that we're also free to witness the effects as something we cause rather than something is happening to us. Being caused by us rather than happening to us. We're not the victims of it, we're the cause of it. To think we're victims at all at any point is to think that we can be irresponsible when our nature is responsible. The absolute nature of life is responsible. Our nature is the same as nature's nature. There's no trees arguing over wanting to be what they're not.
And I remember when we first started talking about this, I was like, I'll take 50% of it. Yeah, it's half my responsibility. You're like, no, it's 100%. So that was kind of good.
Well, it can seem absurd to consider that, because in the older way of thinking, that would mean it's my responsibility and nobody else's. And now I have to take an over, like be an Al-Anon, and all of a sudden now I'm responsible for everybody else. And I've got a micro. That was the position I took when I thought that my thinking was in fact reality, that I had to then impose my thinking on everyone and everything. And all those things had to obey my thoughts, or I was depressed, I was upset, I was at odds with the world, rather than see it was my thoughts that were limited, that weren't true, that I was struggling with. So the 100% also means everyone is 100% responsible. So now I've got 8.5 billion allies.
Wonderful.
That are based on the same nature.
Wonderful.
So now think of that. If we're all in the same team, there's no loser. We're not playing against each other anymore. We're now playing the part and role that we're playing in favor of all rather than against any. In favor of myself, in favor of all those thoughts, is to think that I am against all others. And that's it's impossible because it isn't possible, but it's certainly possible to think. And something that I was sort of working on and developing a little more yesterday, because you brought it up, Anthony, is why would we be allowed to do such horrible things? If we are truly free to think what we want, and I mean truly free is an absolute state of being. And my suspicion is that freedom, responsibility, and choice are sort of the triangle of human capacity. When I'm acting responsible on the responsibility that I already am, I'm choosing freely to do things that are inspired rather than desperately choosing to fix things that seem to get worse. There's a natural progression there. But you had asked at one point, why would we be allowed to do such horrible things? Well, if we were condemned to any less than having the potential to do all those things, that would not be love, giving us complete and utter freedom to make choices to do what we want. If we could only do the good things, we would be condemned to not doing the wrong things, and we wouldn't have the freedom to value and recognize our involvement in it and our choices that we make. and our complicity in those other choices being made by people that we think are doing things we would never do, but to start seeing what we do is an interactive whole that we're participating in, is to start to recognize that the responsibility is each of ours also for all those things that are going on out there. If I have functioned at a level that has so little influence in the world, that's a choice I've made in terms of my functional capacity. If I'm intimately connected to everyone in this world, and I've chosen only to pay attention to the people that really irritate me or the ones closest to me to care for, and think that those are the only things I can do, rather than notice that the impact is being, the more I commit to, the more that impact is starting to affect everyone, everywhere. While it may be imperceptible, if there's 2 billion people doing what I'm doing, it starts to be a little more obvious. And if there's any influence we have, certainly it would be thinking about things that we may already all have, rather than things we think we need to get somewhere in some place we never seem to find. To start talking about it and thinking about it in those terms, and seeing that if we have a nature, it's natural.
Isn't like obsessive thinking like an attempt to be responsible, just misguided in the sense that like I'm trying to control outcomes or take care of whatever the problem it is on my own, bear it on my shoulder, so to speak. But I don't get to just burst the bubble by myself just because I don't know what real responsibility looks like asking for help, for example.
If it's real and it's your nature, the idea that you don't know it would be another idea that would lead you to think what you need to be is overly responsible, which is an admission that you're not responsible. So you're actually creating the conflict in the idea that what you need to be is more responsible, which is, again, the admission that you don't think you're responsible. So the thinking has gotten so top heavy and so culturally embedded in our repetition of it, the repeating of it, that is sort of a public addiction being perpetuated in the name of thinking we're going to get somewhere and fix it, when in fact it isn't broken, except for the thinking we're doing about it. We're thinking of it in some part and piece, and we have to be true. I have to express reality to actually be a part of reality, rather than realize I am absolutely a part of reality and I don't always express it. Now I can start looking at what I'm doing as something I am doing that can be corrected, and I can adjust, that is flexible, not inherent in me, and something that's just wrong with me and something I can't do anything about. It starts to be something I'm more than capable, because it goes from being reality of everything to simply being something I'm doing. Oh, if I'm doing it and I recognize I'm the one starting it, I can all of a sudden start thinking, there's no reason in the world I need to continue, ever. And in page 84, where there's talking about neutrality, that's exactly what it says. Seems to happen for us, not by us. It just, something happens. There's no willpower involved. There's no fight involved. None of it. It just seems to happen. Neutrality. I mean, that would be, if anybody's got a big book, it would be worth looking that up really quick and reading it. I think it's top of 84, James. It describes this thing as being inherent rather than something we're finally doing right ourselves. We've given way and all of a sudden are witnessing the knowing that we've always had, rather than thinking of it as something we need to think we know before we could know it.
The neutrality part, or just top of 84? 85 is where they
start at the bottom of 84.
And we've ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol, for by this time sanity will have returned. We will seldom be interested in liquor. If tempted, we recoil from it as from a hot flame. We react sanely, normally, and we will find that this has happened automatically. We will see that our new attitude towards liquor has been given us without any thought or effort on our part. It just comes. That is the miracle of it. We're not fighting it. Neither are we avoiding temptation. We feel as though we had been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We've not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. We are neither cocky nor are we afraid. This is our experience. This is how we react as long as we keep in fit spiritual condition.
So now he's talking about that in relation to alcohol. And what does that mean? We can think about it, we can be near it. And to think about it and be near it doesn't mean we absolutely have to pick it up and drink it.
Meaning we can
Right.
be near our obsessive thinking without taking action on it.
Exactly. You can just notice what it is, be honest, say, oh. Now, to your point also, being inspired can often, Anthony and I talked about this, being inspired can look a lot like an obsession, but there's one big difference. Inspiration doesn't have us feel condemned. And if we were condemned to inspiration, how bad could that be? Right? What would be wrong with being condemned to inspiration? It'd feel great. It's like condemned to joy, it's condemned to love. Even if that possibility existed, it would not be a problem. But condemned to condemnation is a problem because it isn't natural that we're condemned. It's a choice to make believe what we're doing is true, what we're doing is right, what we're doing is real. While we have the right, doesn't make it right. So noticing it is actually reading our body language. And our body is filled with sensory organs. And to sensory deprivation would be denial, thinking that ignoring things is in fact not having them impact us anymore, when in fact the impact grows in our body, gets worse. Just like if we ignore the fact that we can't drink and continue to drink and think it's the right thing, it doesn't matter what we think, it matters what we actually act on and do. So the impact on our body continues to depreciate our body. We get sicker. It's the same with the thinking. The chemicals in our body that we're igniting and triggering for this fake emergency that we're creating is as though we're being chased by a tiger or a bear or some life-threatening animal all day long, 24 hours a day. And that's not what our body was designed to do. It was designed to deal in quick spurts with emergencies so that we could escape them and continue to survive and thrive. When we
I know
do it 24
my place was kind of messy. We talked about this a lot, and I finally started doing some cleaning, and it feels so much better because I don't have to beat myself up about it's messy. But then I realized I'm starting to think, God, why didn't you do this so much sooner? You're so wrong for waiting this long, even though I can't catch a break.
So notice, that's a good point, Anthony. You can't catch a break when you continue to use the same thinking
Yeah.
because it's constantly broken. So you can't catch it because you're creating it. That's like a catcher trying to catch his mitt.
It's so upsetting that I waited so long. It's like, God, if you would have just done this years ago, you would have been so much happier all this time.
That's not what you're upset about, Anthony. You're upset about thinking there's a time in place somewhere that no longer exists while you're in the present, thinking about a time and place that doesn't exist as being possible to exist sufficiently to be changed.
Yeah.
So that now you are bemoaning in the present the exact same thing you're claiming you would have been feeling better about if you'd started earlier, but apparently it's not early enough to start now.
Yeah.
So again, that thinking is very deceptive, very cunning, very baffling, seemingly confusing, but if you look at the facts and look at the effects and start noticing the discomfort and just let that be enough,
Yeah.
it immediately rehabilitates that sensory deprivation, that desensitization, all that stuff immediately starts to correct very quickly because you're not constantly applying that layer of thinking about it wrongly that is creating the desensitization. There is no accumulation of desensitization, and yet our muscles do, in our brain anyhow, our muscles do begin to atrophy and get chewed up with the acids and all this stuff. They get tense. No blood tension creates inflammation. Inflammation is one of the major causes of disease. Tension creates constipation. We're not designed to hold back shit. And yet we think shit and thinking more shit and getting our shit together is somehow a solution. We talk about it openly.
I had a friend that was mad, and they acted out with some behavior, and I said, it's really fear. They say that anger is fear dressed up in drag. So I said, what is the fear? I think you're really afraid of something. They didn't answer me, but I'm wondering, is that always pretty much, is that true? That if somebody's angry, it's really a fear of losing something, maybe, or a fear of not getting what they want, or
Well, we talked about that recently. If the idea I have about myself is that all I am is what I think, because I'm thinking about my thinking itself, and I have decided that that has becomes myself, and I know that I know that I am that knowingness, why wouldn't I be afraid to create an image and likeness that I hate and loathe and am scared of because I know that it's killing my experience, literally killing my potential to function? And I am the one doing it. I am creating the imposter, the seeming ego. We talk about ego very often as this funny thing that we do every once in a while, that's some part of us. We talk about it almost as though it's separate from us. Oh, well, my ego, this, that, and the other thing. My ego does this. My ego does, as though it's a human inside of us. So that would suggest we have a split personality, we're schizophrenic. That is a hallucination being taken, illusion being taken as reality. It's not real. It's just induced insanity, making believe that's who I am. And through history, fairy tales, all kinds of literature has talked about people coming to terms with themselves. And to come to terms with the self, as far as I can tell, is to begin to admit the self is nothing more than a thought thinking about itself. So I have employed my thinking, which is fundamental to my human capacity to function, and turned it into a dysfunctional liability. I've used imagination as a source of my seeming reality, when in fact, imagination is a huge asset. And I don't think of it that way because I think of it as reality. So I've taken fantasy and turned it into reality and wonder why I feel like there's a deficit going on, and that I'm not enough, and that I loathe myself, self-loathing, self-hate, self-abuse. Think of all the words attached to that self.
There's a good thing, but I can't remember it's called the 7-Day Mental Diet by one of the founders of the club. I can't remember his name. But anyways, it's basically an exercise. If you can 7 days just focus on positivity or whatever, like the golden key and Emmett Fox, that's who it is. And then just shake off whatever negative thinking comes on. That's the goal. But I've not met anyone that's made it more than 3 hours into the diet, because you realize, like, if I'm really consciously focused on thinking of God or thinking of positive stuff, I can do that. But as soon as life starts happening, I'll fall into that. And like the exercise is to do it for 7 days. And if you do slip, or so to speak, then you just give yourself a break and then start the next day. But the one thing it did show me is just how consuming my negative thinking is, like, throughout the day. Like my general reaction to most things is a negative thought.
Obsessive thoughts are trying to negate reality with the understanding that if you think more about those thoughts, think more about thinking. We talk about it as thinking more about ourselves. We're not thinking about ourselves, we're thinking about our thinking, which is why we have thinking about thinking creates more thoughts. That's obsessive thinking. So when we're thinking about our thinking and thinking that more thinking about our thinking is going to solve the problem, like now all I need to do is think of positive. You can't think positive thoughts without thinking negative thoughts. There's no such thing. Good and bad, all the value judgments are based on contrary positions. Good and bad, up and down, in and out. They're all based on that. Wrong and right, all that stuff. False, true, all that stuff, based on oppositions. But when you're dealing with absolute states of being, the opposite of the absolute state of being is the same. There is no difference. There is no opposite. So how the absolute reveals itself in the opposites is to start to see that opposites are always held together by common ground, which is why the law of attraction is that opposites attract. Why do they attract? Because they're not a part. We can think of them as a part and think of them as something we shouldn't be doing, but I will guarantee you any of those efforts will last and then fail. They're not permanent because they require obsessive thinking to maintain them. If we are already in perfect balance and thinking we're not, we're thinking has to bring us back into balance rather than see that it's the thinking about trying to be in balance that's imbalanced and causing the problem. It's again thinking about thinking rather than saying, if I have a knowing nature and starting to just contemplate with my thinking, if I have a knowing nature, I don't have as much to think about if I'm honest about it. And all of a sudden, my thinking starts following the leader naturally because that lead has always been there. And I have been busy and consumed trying to think my thinking is the leader, my thinking is the master, my thinking is the sole source of existence. If that's true, someone would have succeeded so far, and through human history, seeking has been a very common prescription. We've been looking and looking and looking because we haven't admitted the thing we've been looking for has never been lost, and it can't be lost. It's not in the lost and found category.
What do you think about all this, Arliss?
I was going to say, is this making sense, Harless?
I can only speak from my experience, really.
Me too.
That I have to define thinking, first of all, because what passes for thinking often is a thought on a loop, just one thought that's hovering around some sort of expectation of a resolution of the thought that started the whole thing going. Whether it's a negative thought or a positive thought, whether it's what we call negative or positive thought, is generally it wants to make a story. And once it gets a story going, then we start, what we think we're doing is thinking about the story, but we're really just inside the energy of this story that has its own kind of thing going. I would use the example of waking up in the morning and my first thought is, I got to get some money. I don't know why I think that. I didn't go to bed without money. I didn't. So I'll think, wow, I'll meditate. So I sit quietly and I get up and I go in the kitchen. When I'm finished, I get my coffee, I sit down, and then another thought is, I really need some money. So I start thinking about money and how I'm going to get some. And even if the notion is that I'm planning in my mind how I'm going to get some money, it's still hovering around this thought that is money. So around noon, I call the guy that's in charge of my money and I say, I think I need some money. And he says, why? And I'll say, well, don't I? And he'll say, well, are you going to buy something like a house or a boat or something? What's the principle of the exercise? I say to live off the income of interest and investments. And that's what we're doing. So what's your question? And then there's a pause and he goes, oh, this is one of those phone calls. And I realize I've spent 3 hours, basically what I think of as thinking toward a solution to something, but since the problem is something that the thought created, it's an imaginary problem and there's no solution to an imaginary problem. There's
Wonderful. Wonderful.
So I spend most of my time in what I call thinking, solving imaginary problems, is my experience. And then then I was talking to a friend of mine who's a complete golf fanatic. And I said, I'm not a golf fanatic. I go out with friends of mine who want a companion to golf. And so I'll swing the club with them. And, I don't have anything on it. So I have a pretty good time most of the time. What I've found that's really interesting about golf is, there are a couple of precepts you're always doing about you're standing at address and you want to be relaxed and you take you take the club back slowly and, you're swinging with your hips and all this kind of thing and keep your head down, keep your head down. This is the thing that I always find hilarious is I'll sit there as I'm on the downswing going, keep your head down, and I'll look up. I'll say, how do you explain that phenomenon to my friend who's a, pretty good golfer? And he said, well, you have to separate your intent from the action. Once you get the intent, which is every shot has a purpose. So I want to put the ball here, I want to put it there, and I want to get it loft, or I want to hit it. Once you set that, then stop. And now just be in the action, because there's no thought in the action if you're properly. It's just action. And I think because of observing cows, I have cows, and observing cows, I don't know what's going on inside their head. I have a general idea, which is nothing. They're just being cows. They're just out there and they have a function as to, graze, chew cud, make other cows. If they're startled in the field, they will run and stop when they feel like they've got enough distance between what has startled them and where they are, and they'll look to see if that's true, and then they'll go back to doing what they're doing. They don't look like they ever look back and go, why is that motherfucker chasing me? What did I ever do to cause that? They don't seem to have any carryover or any kind of resentment or any. I've never had a cow look at me with what I thought was resentment. And I think
They never milk a resentment.
Because I think their brains are not, they don't have the kind of brain that human beings have, which is we've evolved into a consciousness of the past and a consciousness of the future. And so we're making educated guesses based on what's happened to us in the past. And so we're rarely present with that kind of brain activity. So all I know is it's a long kind of answer about this thinking thing, but all I know is that I try to keep my thinking relevant to problem solving, like getting on this Zoom. I got on this morning and I was waiting and I was waiting, and I sent Jack an email saying, "Hey Jack, I'm waiting to get on, I'm trying to solve a problem, which is to get on the Zoom. If I start thinking, what the fuck, Jack? Why the fuck am I just not immediately on, Jack? What's Jack doing? Jesus Christ, it's 12:02. And if I start thinking like that, I'm kind of fucked. So I try to keep it specifically about, like I'm going to miter a joint, so I need to figure out where the cut is and the opposite cut and what kind of angle I want. And it's generally a 90-degree angle. And so I got to figure that. But if I start thinking like, I got to get this done because ... then I'm in the story part, which is fun, but it's not real. And
Bingo.
everything that's not in the present moment is not real to me.
Bingo.
It's not real. And as long as I know that, I can be in the past or I can be in the future and not be particularly troubled, as long as I know that that's where I am and it's not real. What I got out of what he was kind of open with and was staying on is is that we get my experience about addiction is I'm addicted to my thinking. And I think it's real. And I don't know that that's particularly unique to the species, that the species seems to have that part, the way our brains are, we get addicted to it. And you see it right now, particularly, at least in my experience of my life, the time I've been alive, it seems, and I'm allowing for the fact that I'm a little older, and that it tends to get a little bit more, back in the day when I got, and that voice that comes over you when you start thinking about the past, it's like you're inhabited by a voice that goes, these people don't know what the fuck they're talking about it. But right now we're really at an inflection point, at least in the history of my life, looking around, of where people are absolutely addicted to their thinking, like at a critical, very, very like culturally destructive way. And it's easy to get caught up in that. So,
Well, then how do you explain mad cow disease, though?
I'm sorry?
How do you explain mad cow disease if these cows have it so together?
They thought they were coming back as horses.
Yeah.
I like what you're saying. Is I'm going to try that. Just solve solutions. I'm not doing anything but I'm not going to beat myself why I didn't do it sooner. I should have. Why am I struggling with this? Just problem solving only. I'm going to try that.
What's that thing that Eckhart Tolle said that, I always like the guys I listen to who, I've always I always found it interesting that the gurus or the priests or the what we call enlightened thinkers that we refer to a lot are generally living by themselves with other people like them, and they don't have children. And so it's good to take what they're saying and apply those principles and all, but I really like the guys who are coming from experience. And like Eckhart Tolle says, he was about to kill himself from this notion that Anthony referred to, where you start gang banging yourself like, God, I can't believe I thought that. What's the matter with me? Jesus, I'm an idiot. I should have gotten this shit straight when I was a kid. Da 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 da. And then he suddenly had this moment where he went, wait a minute. Who's wanting to kill who? Who is this who? And he started hearing it as a voice rather than a self. And I think we talked about this too, Jack. The idea of a self is sort of a sketchy little proposition about when we're talking about, like, even in 12-step modalities, when they say we need to get out of ourselves. Well, what are we talking about? We're talking about the self, the thinking self that wants things and thinks when it gets those things that it'll calm down, or it thinks that there's somebody in my way, or the weather's not to my liking. That Freud calls it the ego. I call it the wanter. That voice that just always wants something. It's always wanting something. But
Yeah.
it's a voice. If I think it's myself, I'm in trouble, because then, well, I don't have
This
a
is
high
great. This
opinion
is
of
great,
that
Arliss.
voice. So it's a mystery. I mean, and this again is my experience. I might wake up tomorrow and say, Jesus Christ, Arliss, you went on for a long time. You didn't say a goddamn thing. Why don't you just be quiet? But it's a mystery.
Look at the difference between a cow that you used as a good example and a bull. A bull isn't that much different from a cow, but man, that thing's got one thing on its mind: attacking.
Well, eating probably precedes that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
survival. But
it also has a different relationship to sex than a cow does. It has a
good point.
different function.
I know
So-
they chase that food truck. They know exactly what time that food's coming and they know what that truck sounds like and they run after that truck.
Well, I'll just give you a quick example of a bull. You know, we have Red Angus bull, and he'll sit down in the paddock. They have 30 heifers up there that he's meant to cover, and he'll go up in there when it's time, when they come in to season. He'll go up there and he weighs a ton, literally.
Yeah.
He'll go up there and run these 30 heifers around. He doesn't have to run them anywhere because they're contained in one spot, but he'll run them up into the corner and run them up in the corner. And all he wants to do is, you know, mount these heifers. And when he's done, after a couple of weeks, he'll come down, he'll weigh about 1,200 pounds. He lost 800 pounds running after these females who are only interested in it just because they're supposed to make, you know, they're in heat season, it's time to make babies. He's completely lost his mind, what we call a mind, you know, but he's functioning. It's just a different relationship to that activity. I don't think there's any thought. I don't think he comes down and goes, I've got women problems. You know, I don't think, you know, I need to see a therapist. You know, I think it's just a biological function. Doesn't.
Did you hit mute?
No. So that was very insightful, Arliss, and
Yeah.
you know, my sense is, and certainly as an actor, you realize that you can take on any character you want. And if you were to make believe that's who you were, when the movie ended, you would be scared to death. Because if you gave the thoughts about that character reality, your reality would seem to end. And that sense we have of that self, and I agree within the big book, he says completely abandon yourself. Let go of old thoughts, absolutely. The result was nil until we let go of old thoughts. What are old thoughts? Thoughts not happening now. Thoughts we're thinking about that were happening but aren't happening now. But what's happening now is we're thinking about them as though they're happening. And that's a major conflict with what's happening because my attention is being paid to something that isn't happening. And I'm wondering why I have attention deficit disorder. When I'm consumed with a past that isn't present and a future that isn't present, but I'm thinking about it as though it is present while the present is passing me by in terms of what I can do in terms of action. So my sense is the animals, you know, I don't know if you know Brad locally here, who's the horse
Yeah.
guy from home. So
Yeah.
Brad says the horse is thinking, but it's not thinking about anything that's not happening. It is absolutely present. So my sense is what we struggle with is we have the contemplative capacity to think about our thinking. And while that is considered to be an extraordinary benefit, any extraordinary benefit can be turned into a liability as quickly as it can be valued. And we have been turning this incredible imagination we have into a liability by imagining that the illusion of our thinking is in fact reality. And those stories we tell that take on all the imagery that would look like reality is no different than a movie being projected through light onto a screen. And if the knowing nature of that bull is inherent, and even the fences, he's not registering that these things are an offense. He's registering according to his instinct and his knowing that he needs to chase them because they're normally in an open field without fences. Humans put the fences up. That was our good idea. But the bull's still operating an inherent knowing of his own awareness without thinking about it at all. So my sense is intuition is in fact wisdom. And it is intuition by definition is thinking beyond reason or knowing beyond reason, meaning there's no reason, logic, or thinking in knowing. It's a knowing beyond reason by definition. So there's no reason I should know it whatsoever because it isn't coming from thinking. It's coming from an absolute inherent knowingness that I must share with everything and everyone if it is in fact that sort of absolute state of being. It isn't something that's divisible. It's something that's actually indivisible and seems to be invisible, except to the understanding I'm able to actually develop in relation to it and say, well, actually, the unseen represents more of what's actually happening than the forms I look at and think is all that's happening. So if there's any substance, which I would say is what physicists are struggling with today, is how to identify all that stuff rather than concede that whether it's identified or not, it's all there doing what it's doing perfectly for us to even consider that we need to think about it correctly. And your thought about meditation, my sense is the ultimate meditation is our daily experience where we're confronting issues that aren't going the way we think they should be going because I thought the thought I had was so real that I thought the only thing that should happen is what I expected to have happen. And when it doesn't happen, I feel crushed by the experience when in fact I'm simply not admitting that my thought was only half-baked when I started. And of course, I got exactly what that half-baked thought would create.
Yeah,
And also, Arliss, the reason you probably have money is because for 50 years, all you did is in the morning, you thought about how do I make money? It was a success. It was a very good thought to have, right?
no, I have just from my experience, that was not on my mind is probably why I did it. I was so, well, I don't need to get into that so much. I just think that, um, it's like what Dr. Paul says in the book, in The Magic Magnifying Mind, what you focus on tends to get larger. And so what you practice, you tend to get better at. And if you practice resentments, you can get really good at them. I think the thing about meditation in my experience that I found was when I first started doing it, the guy told me, he gave me a birthday candle and he said, just light it and wait till it burns down. They burn about 8 minutes. Let's just start with that. So I put it in the lid of a mayonnaise jar, and with a little soft wax, and I lit it. And in a really short period of time, I was bending over trying to get it to burn faster, like fanning it a little bit, thinking, or, just thinking that the actual experience of sitting still was so uncomfortable. It's so absolutely uncomfortable that I had to interrogate that before I could even consider what the purpose of meditation was. And so after years of meditating, what I would say that I've gotten out of it and witnessed the story about getting up off the cushion and going in to make coffee and having this thought come back in my head and thinking it's true because now I've thought it twice, I must need some money. Meditation, whatever, I still, return to the thing. My experience of meditating has just been to experience the phenomenon of, the power of illusion. It's very powerful. And those moments where that falls away and I'm just there. I've had a few of those over the years, and it's, without being hyperbolic about it, I think it saved my life because I thought, oh, that's possible. But I guess I'm getting out of the business of knocking myself around about not being this or not being that. I'm getting out of that business because it's painful and it wastes a lot of time, and the people around me suffer from it inevitably when I'm doing that. I just developed this default thing over the years of, it doesn't always work, and sometimes it takes longer, but generally in the course of a day, I get back to, wait a minute, bud, what's the real problem? And instead of going, we're fond of saying in AA, you know, guys looking in the mirror go, the problem is you, buddy. The problem is you. Instead of even doing that, I just go, no, wait a minute. What is the problem? And I just sit there and I realize there ain't one. I'm not the problem. There is no problem. You know, if I want to make one up, have at it. But, you know, I think we're running around getting in each other's way because we're prosecuting these imaginary fucking problems. I really do. I
Is
think
this
this is
rule
what
62 you're describing?
yeah. Anyway, that's just my experience.
Have you had an emotional relapse at all lately, Arliss?
What?
Emotional relapse.
What do you mean?
Like, you don't know what an emotional relapse is? Like emotional sobriety?
Oh, you're talking about what Bill said that, you know, the new frontier is emotional sobriety, and we're not talking about physical sobriety anymore. And
Well, where you just yell at somebody in public, like where you just lose it.
oh, you're not so much yelling at somebody in public, but you know, having to take a walk in the woods to keep from, you know, attacking a tractor with a monkey. You
You
know,
seem like you're
I
very
tend to
calm.
indulge myself when I'm by myself thinking that nobody's getting hurt, but in fact, it's very, very poisonous to get that angry even in private. You know, I don't know. I think I just don't have the big. I mean, what do you let me just ask the question. What are you supposed to do if someone you really, really love
Yeah.
and you love them so much that you sort of take that for granted even, or you don't think about it all that much, but somebody you really, really love is suddenly dead. Are you not supposed to be shocked and unmoored and all the things that come with grief? Are we not, do we imagine that if we're sober enough, we won't feel grief? Or do we imagine that? I think the standard sometimes we unconsciously hold ourselves to uh, about how we're supposed to feel relative to this problem of thinking. I've found grief to be completely burns down any idea I have about myself or the world or anything else. It's a completely destabilizing kind of emotion, you know?
My sense is, Arliss, that we have worked so hard to desensitize ourselves to what we're actually feeling that we think the goal in life is being non-existent, which is why suicidal tendencies and compulsions seem to be so automatic.
Yeah.
We're trying to kill ourselves when in fact what we're trying to kill is the feelings we're having about what's wrong, that we are grieving over the loss of actually experiencing the fullness of the moment while making believe it's everyone and everyone else that's doing things that cause it. And addiction by nature is the idea I don't have anything to do with it. So apparently there's nothing I can do about it, but continue to do the exact wrong thing over and over and over again because it's my only choice. Think about using choice as an excuse when choice always allows not to be chosen when it's thought of principally. The whole point of choice is that you can choose it, not be condemned to it. It wouldn't be a choice. We would be the bull herding the women while they're fully fenced in and don't need to be herded, simply operating on an instinct, not wondering why we should or shouldn't be doing what we're doing. We just do it, functioning on that basis. But we don't feel that. We feel bad. We feel hostile. We feel angry. It builds up in our system to the point where it's very hard to deny. And my experience is those feelings we've been given offer us a colorful range of perspective on the thinking we're doing in terms of how well we are aligning with reality and life's terms in our thinking. And the grief, my sense is it's not about the dead bodies and the people who have passed. It's the fact that we never fully witnessed them in their presence and spent time with them kind of making these contractual arrangements to live alongside them by not doing things that really aggravated them and have them not doing things that really aggravate us. And we called it love, when in fact it was somewhat contractual and somewhat amenable to simply being amongst people, like you described the gurus, being amongst similarly minded people that were a lot easier to like, while in fact the love between us was never broken, if that's the essence of this infinite absolute nature that we share. So I think you're speaking to so many of the points, because the fact is we affect everyone because we're a part of everything. And to think that we're not is another insane idea. And in that reading that James did, he's talking about we've been returned to sanity in relation to drinking. The returning to sanity in relation to thinking is start to look at the absolute nature of reality as being absolute, not something we can choose. It isn't an option. It's not a negotiation. To think of it that way thinks that thinking is more powerful and that we actually block it, when what we block is our mental capacity to function. So we're taking the human aspect and saying I'm completely incapacitated in terms of my mentality to deal with what's actually happening, and thinking the world becomes complex and God isn't giving me what I want, when if there's an infinite spirit, I've had everything all along and I've simply been thinking I didn't. So addiction, in my experience, is the idea that I'm not doing what I'm doing as a result, not thinking what I'm thinking. And what I began to realize is most of what I'm struggling with are thoughts I don't even think I'm thinking. And whatever that thought is, it seems to be some kind of an analytical process trying to come to a solution that I keep trying to put a period at the end of to stop the thinking. And it isn't the thinking I'm trying to stop, it's the reliance on thinking as the sole source of my experience in my life that I'm trying to stop desperately by thinking more about thinking in relation to it. And I'm driving myself literally insane with ideas that have no basis in reality whatsoever. While the whole time, reality is not affected at all. Truth is not affected at all. These absolute states of being have absolutely no impact on it. Only my mentality is impacted. My sense of self, which is just, again, a sense that's imagined, illusion, made believe to be true, made believe to be real. So talking about it gives me great relief, because I was super sensitive as a young kid and always felt something was wrong. It took sobriety to help me see that the wrong that was largely being created was the wrong that I was doing. But in seeing that clearly, like Bill says, we wouldn't treat sick friends the way we treat people who are ill, is to start see that the illness is pervasive enough to have encapsulated or incorporated all of humanity. And we are living with a world where we're seeing the effects of that publicly and socially and politically in the sick way that they would be expressed in our own experience. And perhaps as a species, we're starting to find our bottom, to start talking about it openly, look at it honestly, and actually bring real dissipation and dissolution, because there hasn't been a problem any longer than we've been maintaining it as though it's a problem. The reality of it is there isn't any problem. The seeming reality within my thinking, when I think thinking is reality, is everything's a problem and everyone's a problem, and anything anyone does that doesn't agree with how I try to appear to be and seem to be seems to be a problem, when in fact that's all just seeming and appearance based on what I'm projecting in terms of an image. So I suspect COVID helped, in my experience, I heard more people say I don't know what to make of things than I ever heard people say collectively. And I said, that's probably the best honest assessment you can make at this point. And that's actually starting at a point that allows for great possibility, rather than concluding a point that begins to eliminate anything other than continuing to think there's nothing we can do about anything, when in fact we've been doing something about everything the whole time, and really begin to see that it's what we all do individually that affects us collectively. We're all participating in it, but we each have this seeming freedom to choose what we want to think. That seems to be the one thing that each one of our bodies has, is a brain that is thinking for the body it's in. And some proof to that is that when we're not thinking, it seems to continue. When we're not thinking about our thinking, it seems to continue thinking, to be able to provide the blood flow and all of the other anatomical and physiological and biological chemicals to get to where they need to be so that we can wake up in the morning. And this
And
other,
going back to your cow story, Arliss, these cows are so happy, they're not worrying about anything. The truth is, though, they're going to die and they're being raised for food, and they just can't see that, you know. So it's like, yeah, it's good that they're happy and they don't see anything, but it's also terrible because if they thought about it, they would get the hell out of there.
Well, these are
we're gonna,
just my, you know, these are dairy cows, and probably cows would be extinct in America, certainly if we didn't eat them. I mean, they, but I don't, I think I'm only using the example of a cow to imagine, some place, to imagine the grace that's in those places in my life where I'm not projecting a way that I feel about something into a story that then
Okay.
gets out ahead of myself, and I'm not in the world anymore. I mean, I'm in my imaginary. And the problem with being in an imaginary world is nobody can be there with you. And this is the thing about the real problem of any kind of addiction is that, and the book talks about this, and neuroscientists talk about this, is this self-imposed isolation that you create a situation where no one can be there with you because you can't be with outside of your own experience. You're cut off from, and I mean, how many times I heard guys talking about, yeah, I started out smoking in a room full of people, and then I ended up smoking in a room by myself, and then I ended up smoking in a bathroom by myself, and then I ended up smoking in a refrigerator that I dragged into the bathroom. This this perf this this retreat into and it's not about the drug as much as it's about the perception of self versus this longing that's deeper. If you think about, like, when we're talking about the ego, I don't think it has a whole lot to do with anybody coming in. In fact, the ego says, no, 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 we still got another way to go here. We could go this way. We could, just take a break. We'll do this. We'll move. We'll get a new job or whatever. And at least in my experience, the ego has nothing to do with the moment that you go, fuck, I don't know what to do. So why would it have anything to do with, maintaining that?
Interestingly, ego as a word in Latin is a capital I, and yet we use it today as the small I, the false image, this thing that seems to be a mischievous little imp in our system that keeps mucking up the wheels, and that may be clever to avoid certain things, but seem to be causing greater pain and suffering in the longer run. So if it is in fact I, we've again taken that and turned addiction is the attempt to turn thinking and illusion into reality, fantasy into reality. As you're describing, what I think that has no substance only appears to have substance within the thinking I do about it when I think it's real rather than simply imagined.
Yeah.
And to live on that basis, as long as we have as a species, it's somewhat been baked into our DNA to adapt to that. We've adapted to it as though it's reality, when in fact it's insanity. And insanity is the seeing and hearing of things not happening. So when I'm talking to voices in my head, I am not talking to voices in my head. I'm talking to thoughts as though they have voices, because I have now taken them into a storytelling mode of creating a narrative that sort of replicates the world, because I want to believe in them as real and believe in them as true. And there's not enough belief that can turn insanity into reality.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't be as harmful as it was if we could just be a supporting character in our stories, but we're always the main character.
Well, we think we are because once we think we're real, we think we're in the thinking rather than observing the thought.
Yeah.
And if we're always the observer, imagining we're in it because now we've been consumed and intoxicated with the thinking, it isn't because we're actually in it. It's because we have created a new illusion that we're actually in it and can't get out.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey,
I've got a funny story. The other day,
I'm sorry, I gotta bail.
Okay,
I
thanks.
just realized I'm
There's
supposed
that
to be
cow
elsewhere.
Carlos, it's
Bailey.
very good to see you, and thank
Yeah, that
you
was
very
good.
To
much.
see you guys. Thanks for
Thanks,
being there, and thanks for listening to me a little bit. Thank you.
Love you, man.
Love you.
So I was
Anthony,
listening.
we're going to end on whatever you're saying too.
Oh, well, it's embarrassing. I don't even want to say it because I knew it was wrong when it was happening. But I would sleep with my window open, and I could hear baby birds in a tree somewhere across the street, and they just weren't chirping. I usually love baby birds chirping, but these just didn't have. There was the worst baby bird chirping. It was driving me nuts, and I knew it was going to go away in a week or whatever. But it was just realizing, God, I'm upset. I can't even tell anybody that I'm upset about the birds, the way they sound, that they don't sound. They were just annoying. So now they're not there, and I'm so grateful. But it's just funny that made me mad for a week. Like, how long are these birds going to stay in this nest?
Start to notice that within this context of time, that satisfaction that is temporary is all coming from this imbued new thinking about old thinking. And we think it's new and we think it's novel, but it's based in the same old idea that thinking our way out of something is actually being out of it while we're thinking in it to be getting there. Rather than beginning to ultimately surrender everything and see that we have never taken a side that actually existed against reality and start to see that reality is real, truth is true, that we have had it all along, and we have all had it and all have it now. And whatever we're doing now about it that isn't true and accurate is having an effect on us that is caustic and contaminated and poisons our experience. Not because it's really poisoning it, because the mentality we are using is contaminated by it. So the actions we are taking are going to end in ways that cause caustic consequences in our experience. So I love you guys. Thank you for coming today.
Thanks, you guys.
Very good.
Thanks, James. Welcome.
Glad to see you, James, here. Thank you. So that was the end of our talk. And obviously, the stimulation between the different ideas and different experiences are helping to engage those involved in the conversation. But I also know that those participating out there, your engagement is your participation and your responsiveness and or your reactiveness. And just simply noticing what you're doing while you're doing it is enough to begin with, because it's actually happening. And if we have been contaminated by this idea and intoxicated by the idea that what's not happening is all that's happening, simply beginning to concede what's happening as it's happening is reinforcing the absolute nature of our existence rather than reinforcing the stories we tell. So since we are free to misuse thought, even while hoping more prayer and faith will disabuse us of any abusive effect, when we cause a problem, we cause the effect we're trying to avoid. To think we should or shouldn't be relieved, to think that we should or can be relieved of the effect is clear evidence we claim to have nothing to do with the cause. Cause and effect are like two sides of the same coin that cannot be separated while the coin remains whole. Any more than we can be separate or apart from an infinite source, yet we can feel incomplete and unwhole and disconnected by the thinking we're doing. Since our thinking is coming from our human experience, those are certainly things that we can feel. We are perfectly free to think what we can and do, and we are perfectly free to suffer the effects of the contempt we have for actual reality in the ideas we maintain about our thinking being reality. To think we create reality is to think all things should obey the laws of our thinking. Any experience witnessed honestly is enough to tell us that things and people do what they do and that it is seldom ever what is thought to be all they should do. So what I'm thinking about it is not what people do. And yet when I think my thinking is reality, I think that all that should happen is what I thought when I first had the thought. And it never seems to be that. That would be pretty good evidence that something's wrong in the thinking. When things don't count, they don't add up. And any imbalance is indicated by any lack of accountability. Accountability, in this case, is not correcting the problem by doing the opposite, since that would just be adding more conflicted thinking to an existing mental conflict. Accountability accounts for the successive, consistent success of any present failure. If we can, and we can, admit and concede what we're doing has never worked, admit and concede what we're doing has never worked. It's the beginning of noticing that we're able to notice. We are the observers, able to notice. So to see this is to accurately concede that more is never enough, because more nonsense ever makes more sense. We have senses so we can navigate our human experience on Earth and in our universe, not only on Earth and in our universe, and not only to survive, but to thrive by expressing our abundant nature. Thinking baseless thoughts, our reality turns thinking into a lie, fighting to be true. This core addiction is mental, and the chronic obsession is never enough to resolve the problem. So it continues. The greatest substance abuse is imagining lies have any substance. To think such things is possible, certainly. And yet, all we do is induce hallucinations that turn wonder and the asset of our imagination into a liability. This form of thinking is as inane as it is insane. And we know it, and the discomfort we naturally feel while perpetuating it. We feel the discomfort. We know something's wrong. We can always think again, and we can always know what we know in the infinite sense, regardless of what we think. So while we're thinking things that are conflicted, we can certainly remind our thinking that we know, and that we are aware of our awareness. If we weren't, we wouldn't be noticing what's wrong in the thinking. We wouldn't be feeling bad about it. Mental blocks block useful mentality, not reality. Mental blocks are sick thoughts we employ to try to dominate nature. This is not going very well, nor has it ever gone well. These thoughts do not disrupt our actual nature, but they certainly wreak havoc in our sick interreactions to the natural law and order of nature. Life's terms are our nature, and the terms of our life forms ability to respond and function at full capacity. To think in honest terms restores mental order, since the natural order is always in perfect order. As these terms are thought of accurately, anxious disorders and the resulting societal disorder will dissipate by turning desperate reactions into inspired actions that will naturally and abundantly benefit all that are and all that is. We each impact everything, and Arliss made that point today very clear. And we impact everyone with how we think about what we think. It isn't thinking that's the problem, it's how we think about what we think. And when we choose to think what we think is reality and truth, we set ourselves up to fight reality and fight truth and everyone and everything as a result. It's impossible to win that battle. Our subsequent actions also are toxic and corrupt by that thinking, because thinking precedes all voluntary actions. If you've ever wanted to change the world, you've been changing it all along. Not liking the change we make does not reduce, limit, or change our responsibility for this world. Considering this, it may be worth wondering to see if the world we've changed is the most useful world for all that are and all that is. Like it or not, we each play a part, and the part we play starts now with each thought we freely choose. Thank you for listening, participating, and our relationship. I know you're listening now. I don't have to know who you are and what time you're doing it and where you are to know you're listening. And your participation is your responsiveness, as I said earlier, your reactiveness. If there are things you completely don't understand or don't think you understand, doesn't necessarily mean those things are not understandable. And if you think you don't know, it doesn't mean you don't know. Thinking can be as deceptive as we use it. And certainly, if denial has become popular enough to make believe we have nothing to do with what's happening, which is really an argument for non-existence and suicide. It's a suicidal thought, a suicidal tendency to think we have nothing to do with anything. It may be worth thinking a little more about how we're thinking about what we're thinking. Thanks for listening.